Mentioned that there's been ongoing conversation in the chat with a lot of references and good material. So just want to let people know that. Um, Stephen, are you okay with going a half hour early?
Yeah, actually, I'm perfectly fine if that is okay.
Okay. If you want to get started with the
Yeah, now I have 20 minutes, correct, for the presentation?
yeah, usually we've been having a notice at 15 minutes and then
Okay.
going up to 20, but 20 is the hard kind of the hard cut.
Okay,
Since
because I
we
got
have
my
some.
own timer at 20 minutes, so if I go over, it's gonna bing in my ear very
Okay.
loudly. So, yeah,
Don't want that.
one of my presentations I went over and I didn't even realize it. So, okay, so
Okay.
let's just go here, 20
So,
minutes.
Stephen Satkiewicz is an independent scholar whose research areas are related to civilization sciences, social complexity, big history, historical biology, military history, war studies, international relations, geopolitics. Um, he is the book review editor for the academic journal Comparative Civilizations Review, served as editor of the International Society for Comparative Studies of Civilizations newsletter from 2016 to 2018. He produces a podcast for the New Book Network on books concerning topics in his research area. Stephen?
Thank you. And thank you for all for joining me and also for the interesting discussions so far. So my topic is, as you can tell from here, meta-strategic cultures and the dynamics of deep axialization, kind of a civilizational question to address in big history. Don't worry, I'm going to explain what these terms mean in a moment. How do I move the slides? Oh, okay. Sorry. Okay, so the main arguments, just to outline them at the beginning. First off, this is a civilizational contribution to big history. I have in my previous publications and presentations given a rough a definition of what civilizations mean. I like the idea that, or the metaphor that Pitram Sorokin gave of the social and cultural universe, which I think is kind of relevant here to big history. And it kind of, I even marked down a thought I just had listening to the other presentations of, maybe that's a new metaphoric understanding of the multiverse. We're each coming from different universes. In my case, the social cultural universe. We had one from the biological universe, and so forth. But I also want to re-examine the concept of the axial age, and I'll get into this in a moment, rather than as a time period, but more as a longue durée process that has shaped a lot of the ways that humans have thought about and conceived of the world. And this is a process that has continued on throughout history, even to this day, even impacting the way modernity operates. And of course, through this process of deep axialization, this has also had an impact on human understandings of war, peace, strategy, and world order. So in some ways, how we conceive our conceptions of what reality and what the world are and how they've evolved over history has also had a deep impact on how we even understand important concepts of, war, peace, and all that. So it's kind of like almost like a trickle effect from like what our conceptions of what reality or what the universe or whatever the cosmos is has an impact on us and in our lives. So, just a real quick summary of some of the theoretical foundations for my work: civilizational sciences, historical macro sociology, not historical biology. Dave misread that, but that's okay. Strategic history, geopolitics and international relations, and hermeneutics, which is kind of the science of how do you properly interpret texts and symbols, especially from different time periods. So, a little bit of a different framework than from some of our other participants here who are more in the hard quantifiable sciences. I'm kind of more in the qualitative soft sciences, the human and social sciences. But as I also am going to try to argue, there isn't an unbridgeable gap. Even if we want to go with the two cultures metaphor, that doesn't mean there aren't bridges that or roads that can be used to connect the two. So even if we're not exactly in the exact same area, that doesn't mean we can't communicate with each other. Karl Jaspers was the one who came up with the concept of the axial age. Max Weber, of course, pioneered a lot of the historical sociology of religions and civilizations. Pithram Sorokin, who I just mentioned. Christopher Dawson kind of had an interesting idea that human culture was both material but also intangible, idealential. And one of these factors, which gets into the talk about geography, I believe that was yesterday, even location, how man interacts with his environment has an impact on how he interacts and conceives of reality. It's not completely dependent on environment, but it is an influence. Eric Voegelin, who has been a deep influence on me on big history because he kind of noted that you couldn't simply conceive of history as one single linear process. It's actually like all over the place. It's these processes and configurations are just they're going backwards, forwards, up and down, all over the place. And I'm crudely explaining that here. S.N. Eisenstadt was a major civilizational scholar, and then Colin S. Gray, who I'm going to mention earlier, did strategic history. So, what are possible gaps in big history? Forgive me. Well, again, it's a more interpretive, more humanistic, and social scientific approach to big history, and especially relating to human complexity or the human universe, as I just mentioned. This is again a contrast to the common dominance of purely quantifiable methodologies in history, including the social evolutionary school of and cleodynamics of Andrei Korotayev and Peter Turgeon. But having said that, I'm not necessarily against that. In fact, I really have kind of been favorable of a multi-paradigmatic or multiverse type approach framework for future big history work that allows for the different fields and different types of sciences and fields of inquiry to actually interact and work with one another. And we just have to understand that, hey, the social and cultural universe doesn't operate uh, necessarily on the same rules. It's more interpretive than, say, the biological world, but also humans are biological beings, so it's not in that vacuum, if that makes sense. So, what is the axial age concept? Just very quickly, Karl Jaspers was the one who coined it, and it was a period between about 800 to 200 BCE before the Common Era, or BC if we want to go more classical. And this saw the rise of major religious and intellectual traditions that have shaped human consciousness since, like Judaism, Greek philosophy, Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism, etc. And this also later gave birth to a second wave with Christianity, Manichaeanism, and some of the mystery cults that we saw in the ancient world, and also Neo-Confucianism and developments in Buddhism. S.N. Eisenstadt further developed this into the conception of axial civilizations, which are a particular form of macro scale sociocultural configurations. And this provided the framework for modernity, but he also said that modernity was not singular, but multiple. And I'm going to get into this a little bit later. So I kind of present this idea, what I call deep axialization, and this I actually derived from Andrei Korotayev's concept of deep Christianization. Now, to crudely summarize Andrei's point, and if Andrei's in the audience, he's more than free to clarify his concept in the Q&A, but he kind of studied how the Christian teachings of or practices of monogamy and also discouraging cousin marriages over time led to the breakup of older tribal networks. And out of this vacuum came a lot of the civil institutions that we in the modern world kind of take for granted. A very interesting concept, but I also think we could take this concept and then expand it to investigate like what are the long-term processes of not just Christianity, but other axial traditions impacting the norms, values, and mentalities of different cultures and civilizations. And this is a very long-term, nonlinear process of challenge and response where they go through different phases. They go through what I call thresholds of actuality, where for a time, the existing paradigm kind of exists, but then over time it just grows and then it kind of starts having to face challenges. And in this, ruptures and continuity are both involved. It's not one or the other. So it's not, so it is akin to Kuhn's paradigm shifts, but the old paradigms don't necessarily go away, but they do further evolve and develop in response to some of these changes and the changing circumstances. And it's kind of like similar to the discussion we had in AI, how in some ways the older ideas or the older methods actually start coming back in response to changing circumstances. So it's not necessarily the old gets replaced by the new, but sometimes there's the new, but then we start seeing flaws in the new. So then we start going back to the old, or at least trying to relearn some of the old, and then we intermix it with the new. Something kind of like this, if I could just crudely mention this. Now, I was influenced a little bit by the theologian John Henry Newman, who articulated this concept of development within the Christian tradition, how Christianity from its beginning still had a lot of its core elements, but they didn't just drop from the sky wholeheartedly. They did evolve over time, and he called this development. Now, Andre in his talk talked about the distinction between evolution and development, and this is kind of like another nuance to that. And I don't know if it was Newman or some of his commentators like Ian Kerr, but they kind of made this analogy or metaphor of like how a seed has the whole DNA of a tree, even though it hasn't fully grown. But once you plant it and over time it grows, and then eventually you start getting a full-fledged tree, and then from there you even start to get a full forest. So that's kind of how the Christian tradition evolved. Well, again, I think we could also examine this beyond Christianity and kind of look at how this dynamic can be examined in other axial traditions and other civilizations. And even with deep Christianization, as I would interpret it, is kind of along this lines. It's not just how the how monogamy and cousin marriages, that dynamic was so, although, like I said, Andre's original concept is still valid. And I do like this one phrase from the late Father Andrew Greeley, who was a sociologist of religion, and he always kind of said, religion is always declining and always reviving. And if we look at the history of religions, we do see this dynamic at work, and it also gets into like what Lowell and what a lot of us are seeing today, where you see like two completely different dynamics happening at once, but yet at the same time, it's like still part of the same reality. Okay, so that's the first part where I talk about deep axialization, and I do hope to get into more details about this in the paper and in subsequent presentations. But now we get to the concept of strategic culture and strategic history. Like I said, Colin S. Gray was the major articulator of both these concepts. I do have the two definitions. I'm not going to read everything, but I'll just summarize it. A strategic culture is, the shared beliefs, assumptions, and whatnot of a community where they from that it kind of derives like what is appropriate, what is the best means of securing their existence in the long term and achieving strategic objectives. And then Colin S. Gray, a very big but important quotation he has, every community, whatever size, has been in a strategic context, and they've always have had to think of themselves strategically. Like, how do we best secure ourselves? How do we, defend ourselves from our enemies? So, and so forth. So I'm kind of expanding this concept of strategic cultures to another level, to the meta level, to the meta strategic culture, and it focuses on how the deeper existential questions raised by the axial traditions concerning, you know, the meaning of life, the meaning of the world, the nature of the world, what impact has that had on how these cultures or how cultures have understood their own security, their own concepts of war, peace, and how world order works? Now, Clausewitz, of course, had the famous phrase, war is a continuation of politics by other means. That's true. But I also like this one quote from Carl Schmitt. I'm aware of the controversy of Carl Schmitt, but for good or for ill, he has been influential in a lot of political thinking, and particularly in political theology. And that is that in some ways, all of our conceptions of modern politics are actually derived from theology. So to paraphrase it in line with Clausewitz, it's almost like Clausewitz is saying war is the continuation of politics by other means. Schmidt kind of brings in the insight that politics is theology by other means. So this is where it kind of gets interesting that, you know, these conceptions we have of reality, they're not irrelevant to some of these questions. And these are just three examples of how this can work. Again, I really do wish to go into more in depth about this in my later uh, writings and presentations, but I just want to quickly summarize this. For example, during the Warring States period, this witnessed not only the rise of the two main actual traditions of Confucianism and Taoism, it was also this time period that Sun Tzu wrote The Art of War. And there is a lot of discussion and debate that you really can't understand a lot of the nuances of Sun Tzu without understanding Taoism and how Sun Tzu was influenced by Taoism. We also have ancient Greece, where the Peloponnesian War is, the significant period in Greek history where, we see the rise of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. There were philosophers before them, but this is kind of like the major shift in Greek philosophy. This is also the time period where Thucydides wrote his famous History of the Peloponnesian War. And we do have one expert on Greek and Roman history, Tim Doran. By all means, please fill us in with any insights you can have in the chat. And then, of course, we have ancient Israel, and then later early Christianity, with a more providential understanding of conflict and war in the context of the Old Testament. And then later on, this tradition gets synthesized with the Greek tradition by St. Augustine of Hippo to the development of, for example, just war theory. So, of course, through these subsequent axial thresholds, we have produced modernity, but modernity in a multiple form, not in the singular sense, like there's one form of modernity. And S.N. Eisenstadt and then later on Johann Arneson have argued that modernity as a whole is both a break, but also a reconfiguration of axial tradition. So it's not necessarily the entire break from the past, but it's more of like reconfiguring the past to serve present circumstances. So this is why Western modernity is as much a reconfiguration of older Christian ideas as much as it is possibly a break from them. But also, we also see like Chinese conceptions of modernity, even today, are built on Confucianism. We find this in Buddhism and even Islamic modernity. And this is why I think in some ways we need a more post-secular conception. That is, we're moving beyond secularism, but we're kind of taking religion seriously as a form of inquiry and part of the world. And I've also argued this in big history too. We just need to kind of take this seriously. So what does this mean for the world, both in the past but also present and future? Well, we're going to have convergent and divergent strategic and geopolitical prerogatives in the 21st century. And uh, in many ways, this is almost like a geopolitical twist to some of the talks like what Lowell had. And we're deeply interconnected, but then at the same time, that connectedness is also means that a conflict or a dispute in one part of the world is going to affect everybody else. And then also we're seeing this even, as I said, on social media. We're seeing, people can communicate with each other all across the world, but hey, they're also fighting each other over every little possible thing. So it's kind of like, yeah, we're uniting in many ways, but also we're kind of moving away from each other in new ways as well. So again, I just want to
I think
introduce.
you've gone over your 20 minutes, Steve.
Oh, okay. I apologize. Well, I kind of gotten most of it, and I'm just re-establishing my main points from before, and I'm willing to open it up to discussion and comments.
Right. Thank you very much, Stephen. Uh, so I hope we didn't hear that alarm in your headphones. Good timing. So any comments or questions on this? So, what is, this strategic, okay, Andre, want to go ahead?
Yeah, just unmute yourself.
Yeah, there we go. Thanks. I like the connections you're trying to make between basically, ancient sort of mythological history, culture, civilizations, and modern history, culture, civilizations. I've thought about that a bit, and I actually did a degree at Harvard Divinity School and studied a lot about, our ancient religious traditions. And one of those themes that struck me powerfully actually relates to the earlier comment I made about how in the 20th century, 200 million people were somehow, there was some kind of justification to kill them. Um, One of the through lines that connects, I think, the ancient world and the modern world is the notion of apocalypse. And apocalypse is a form of exorcism writ large, which is a kind of cultural selection process, which is not that far removed from Darwin's theory of natural selection process. So we go from natural selection to cultural selection, which in religious and mythological terms is referred to as an exorcist ritual of purification, which in the larger mythic scale is an apocalyptic notion that God or whoever is in charge of the universe is purifying us and redeeming us. And in the biblical tradition, it's those who are loyal to the dominance hierarchy of the particular God are the ones who are faithful and who will survive, as with Noah's Ark, for example, and everyone else is going to be drowned in the flood. And so you can see how the notion of a dominance hierarchy of a god king who needs to purify his empire in ancient Sumeria, Mesopotamia, Israel, America, Germany, France, whatever, in this linear notions of the successive cultural selections of exorcism, apocalypse, and the very word Holocaust, of course, is evocative of that religious tradition. So we're deeply still, we're a deeply mythologized culture, and we haven't evolved again much beyond that. I'd appreciate your response.
Yeah, that is a very good point, and that even brings up one point that Eric Voegelin made that is very interesting, and he noted how apocalypse is one form of historical symbolism, but he also called historical genesis, where actually we try to pinpoint or justify the present day regime. In this case, the 21st century regime, but then we go all the way back to the origins of the universe or the world, the creation myth, to try to justify it that somehow where we're at now and what we're doing now was foreordained by the creation.
Right.
So it's kind of interesting because I know the issue of origins and creation myth have been prominent in big history, and it's kind of interesting that I think in some ways by addressing it from this perspective, are we trying to justify like the 21st century now by going back to the Big Bang in some ways? Are we unconsciously, subconsciously doing that?
Yeah.
And Voegelin kind of noted that sometimes we're kind of doing this unconsciously. It's almost like it's something unavoidable that we do from the mindset of mind, but it's something we have to be aware that we have that temptation to do that. But but it was just kind of interesting the point you made, like how not necessarily that apocalypse is just like natural selection, but you can kind of see, at least in symbolic terms, like certain parallels between the two. And I think that also kind of brings into how, in some ways, these different ideas, these different fields, and these different universes in the metaphoric sense can actually interact and inform and really enrich each other, like their insights. Because honestly, I never would have made that connection by my own. So thank you very much for making that point. And that's also why I'm here, just trying to contribute to the conversation.
Thanks. Your point too is well taken that an origin myth can serve as a legitimation narrative for apocalypse. Because
Hmm.
if we are originally pure, single, with one God and one territory and one empire that defines our identity, and we don't have any notion of difference or cosmopolitanism, as an earlier speaker mentioned, then we're always in this mode of purifying our origins, our race, our gender, our class. And that means every other person is an other. And I always come back to Hegel's rather monstrous notion of how you have the master and the slave, and we're all locked in that dynamic of self and other, and the only way to be a master is to basically suppress, oppress, or kill the slave. And that brings me back to Darwin's theory, actually wonderful kind of analogy between the alpha male gorilla, who becomes the alpha male gorilla, of course, by defeating, oppressing, and killing all of his rival males, which is the scenario that both Freud and Levi-Strauss and a whole bunch of 20th century thinkers have picked up. Anyway, I'm sorry, I'm dominating the conversation. I think Lowell wants to say something.
Yeah, go ahead, Lo.
First of all, thank you so much, Stephen. Really fascinating discussion. And it's clear you've thought a lot about these two big fields of comparative civilization and big history. And I guess, would you just be willing to speak a little bit more generally, kind of at the 30,000-foot level, about how, in terms of thinking about how to develop big history, how should it be in conversation with these other approaches, such as comparative civilizations? Now, you've done it, but is there anything at a kind of a more generic level that could be said?
Oh, there's a lot that can be said on that question, but thank you for pointing that out, because I also want to at least try to provide like examples of how this can work. And like I said, with the comparative approach, we are a little bit more what we call contextual. So it's like we understand, like, hey, the Roman Empire can be compared to like ancient China, but we also have to understand there's similarities, but there's also differences. And I think sometimes with sometimes with the standard big history approaches, we try to address them as if they were like literally the same or the same on development. And I understand why they do that. Like, for example, the social evolution school and cliodynamics, otherwise their models don't work. And if you're trying to address certain questions along those lines, that works. But if you're trying to address other questions, it becomes a little bit problematic. And that's why, again, I'm trying to say we need to approach it from different perspectives, and also just maintain the integrity of the two main different approaches, qualitative and quantitative. Because of course, just even looking at humans, there's so many different ways you can analyze us as humans. Biology, how do we relate to the environment? How do we relate to each other? Sociological, culturally, and so forth, and even philosophically. How do we even think about abstract thoughts? So, and sometimes and also civilizations are more we're more comfortable with uncertainty and also with more of the untangible aspects of existence. So we're more in favor of what we sometimes call integral knowledge, where empirical, but also more theoretical, purely theoretical, for lack of a better term, knowledge are, kind of united together. Is there anything in particular you want me to address, or did I answer that? Yeah, so stop me if I'm just rambling on about stuff. I have a bad habit of doing that.
We're a little over 11, if that matters.
Yeah, okay, I can stop, but feel free to send me any messages in the chat or emails or anything with further comments or suggestions, and I take my leave of absence.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Todd, would you be able to go half hour early?